Hello coders, I hope you are coding well. If you have ever wanted to master the art of securing your Spring applications with the power of JSON Web Tokens, roles and refresh tokens, then you are in the right place. In this comprehensive guide, we will cover everything you need to know, including setting up Spring security, generating and validating JWT tokens, managing user roles for precise access control, and implementing refresh tokens for seamless user experience. So let's get started. Let's begin by understanding what Spring Security is all about. In a nutshell, Spring Security is a powerful framework that helps protect our web applications by managing authentication and authorization. It's like a gatekeeper of your application, ensuring only the right users get access to the right resource. To put it simply, authentication is the process of verifying the identity of a user, while authorization controls what a user is allowed to do once they are authenticated. Imagine trying to enter a top secret facility. First, you need to show your ID, and then, depending on your clearance level, you will be granted access to the certain rooms. Moving on to the role-based authentication and authorization, roles defines a user's group, like user or admin or manager. With this approach, you can finely tune who can access what in your application. Integrating JWT with Spring Security is a fantastic way to secure your APIs. When a user logs in, a JWT is generated and sent back to the client. This token is then included in every request, allowing the server to verify the user's identity and grant access. But what if a JWT expires? This is where refresh tokens come into play. A refresh token is a longer lived token that can be used to get a fresh JWT without requiring the users to log in again. This minimizes the exposure time of the access token and enhance security. Now let's see this whole process through a diagram. As you can see here, we have our backend application based on Spring Boot, and first we can see authentication filter, which is responsible to check or verify the token from the client. And then on the second level, we have our auth controller, which is responsible to log in, register and handle other API calls. On the third level, we have user controller or admin controller, which handles all the API calls related to user or admin. On the start, our front-end application will call the login API, and for that login API, we will bypass the authentication filter and we will go to our login controller and get the access token if the password and username is correct. After that, for example, if a user want to get the details, the front-end application will provide that token in authorization, and in authentication filter of our backend application, we will check that, and if the token is correct and valid, then we will return the response. In this picture, you can see the flow of a refresh token. If a refresh token get expired, our front-end application will call the refresh API, and in the backend, we will check the refresh token. We will verify that refresh token, and if that token is valid, we will send a new token to the user, which he can use in later API calls. Enough theory, let's see this in action. I already created a Spring Boot project. We have APIs with varying access levels, such as public, user, and admin. Let's fire up Postman and make some API calls. So as you can see, we are in our Postman and my application is up on port 8080. And in our signup API call, we are getting first name, last name, email, and password from the user. Let's hit this API, and on success, we will get the user detail which got created in our DB. The second API call is the sign-in API call. On the startup of our application, we will automatically create an admin account. Let's hit the sign-in API, and in the response of this sign-in API, we will get one token and one refresh token. Let's copy this token and move to the next API call. The next API call is about a refresh token. We can simply put our token here and we can send the request, and it will give a new token to us with the refresh token. I created one endpoint which is protected for admin role. Let's add the token here and try to access this endpoint. So as you can see, we got 200 and it says hi admin. Apart from this, we have another endpoint which is only accessible to the users. Let's put the admin token and try to access this API. As you can see here, it is giving 403 because I am an admin and I want to access an endpoint of the user. Let's go back and try to log in the user which we created recently. As you can see, we got the token for the user. Let's copy this and try to access the admin endpoint. It should give 403 and we got 403 for this. Now let's try to access the user endpoint. And this is working fine. And after this, we will create the Spring Boot project and start the implementation by creating user entity. So let's go to Spring Initializer, and in the project I will select Maven as my build tool. The Spring Boot version should be 3.1.3 and the language should be Java. In the group I will write code with projects and I will give artifact as Spring Security. I will choose the packaging as jar and Java language as 17. Let's add the dependencies now. First, we need the web dependency because we need to create the API calls. Second, we need MySQL. We need JPA. You can add the Lombok to reduce the boilerplate code. And that's it for the dependencies. We will add the Spring Security later in the project. You can click on generate and it will give you a zip file of the Spring Boot project. After downloading the project, let's go and extract. After extraction, you can open the project in any IDE. I am using IntelliJ for this video. After extracting the project, you can go to your MySQL workbench and you can click on this icon to create a new schema. For the name of the schema, we can write Spring_security and you need to just click on apply and apply again to create the schema. So our schema got successfully created. After project sync, you can open the source folder, main, and then resource, and then application.properties. So we'll write here some code to connect to our DB. First, you need to give the URL of your data source. You can write spring.datasource.url, and then you need to give the path of your database, which is localhost 3306/database name, which is Spring Security in our case. In the next line, you need to give the username for your data source, which is root in my case. On the third line, we need to give the password for our database. After this, you need to give the driver class name for the MySQL, and then you need to give the method of DDL auto. And I'm just hiding all my SQL queries for my project, and I am setting the format SQL is equal to true. So this is it for our database connection. Now we can open our Java folder and we can start creating the packages which are required for this project. So first of all, we need a config package. Then we need a controller package. After controller, we need the entities package. In entities, we can create a class of user. Let's use the Lombok to generate the getters and setters. We can use the data annotation, and we need an entity annotation. The last annotation is table. In this, we can give name for our table. I'm giving user. In the user, we need a private integer ID. Let's annotate this as ID. Let's give the generated value as well. So we will use the strategy generation type as identity. After ID, we can have our first name as string. Let's duplicate this and rename to second name. Then we need email of the user. After email, we need to have the password. After password, we need to store the role of the user. So to store the role, we need to create another enum. So we can click here and select the new class and select the enum here. In the role, we can write the user and admin. Our user entity is almost completed. Let's create a repository folder. In this repository package, let's create a Java class, user repository, and this should be an interface. Let's annotate this as repository so we can have the basic methods of the JPA. This repository should extend the JPA repository, and here we need to give the class name and data type of our ID. Let's import this user class. Let's run this application to see if the database connection is correct. It is building our project. As you can see, our project is up on 8080. Let's go to our MySQL workbench and refresh our database. And in the tables, we got the user table created. And after this, we will add Spring Security in our application, and we will implement user details in our user. And at the end, we will add JWT service implementation, and we will write all the methods related to creation of the JWT and other operations. So let's get started. Let's go to our POM file and let's add Spring Security dependency here. The group ID is org.springframework.boot and the artifact ID is Spring Boot Starter Security. After adding the Spring Security dependencies, we need 3 more JJWT dependencies. So let's paste them here. So as you can see, the first one is JJWT API, and the group ID for all these 3 dependencies is io.json web token. The second one is JJWT implementation, and the third one is JJWT Jackson. The versions for all these dependencies are 0.11.5. Now after adding the dependencies, let's go and refresh our Maven. You can click this button and you can click on this refresh icon to refresh the dependencies. This will download the dependencies and update the class path. Now as you can see, our sync is done. Now let's go to the user class and implement this class from user details. As you can see, it is giving errors and it wants me to implement some of the methods that are in user details. So let's click on implement methods, and this will basically add 4 to 5 methods in our user entity class. So let's click OK. So the first method is get authorities, and currently by default it is returning null. So we need to update this to return role of our user class. So we can do that list.off and then new simple granted authority and then role.name. The second method is get username, which is email in our case. So we can write here just the email. The next method is account non-expired, and we need to return this as true. And is account non-locked, we can return this as true as well. The next method is credentials non-expired, and we can simply return this true as well. And we need to update is enabled to return the true, because we want our user account non-locked, non-expired and enabled. Okay, let's go to user details, and here you can see we interacted with pretty much all the methods from here, but you can see the one method get password is not here in our user class. So because we are using Lombok data annotation and we have a field with the name of password, and the Lombok is already created the getters and setters for this password, so it will automatically get picked from that getter and setter method. Now this is it for our user entity class, and this is completed. Now let's create a services package in our project. In the services, let's create a service called JWT service, and in the services package, let's create another package with the name of impl that will hold the implementation classes for all the service interfaces. So let's create here the implementation of JWT service. Now don't forget to annotate this class as service so our Spring can create its bean and inject it. In this JWT service, we will write all the methods that can generate the JWT or extract any information from our token or can check some of the fields of the token. Let's start with generate token method that is responsible to build the token for us. This method will accept user details, and here in this method we will return a string. And let's start creating the JWT by using JWTs dot builder dot set subject. So subject is the email of the user, so we can fetch it from user details dot get username. After the subject, we need to set the issue date, that will be new date, and then system dot current time mails. After the issue date, we need to set the expiration, so we will use dot set expiration. We'll use same new date system dot current mails. So now we will add some time in this date. So let's say we will multiply this 1000 with 60 and 24. So this is equals to just more than 1 day, and of course you can change this to your own requirement. And at last we will sign our JWT with a key, so we will use sign with. So here we need a signature key, so we will create another method to get this key. In the next part we need signature, that we will use hs256, and at last we will call the compact method. Now let's create this method get sign in key. This method will return a key, and let's create a variable type of byte. Let's name it as key is equals to, so we will use here decoders coming from JSON web token dot base 64 dot decode, and here we will input our secret key, and then we will return keys dot hmax share key for. So in this parameter we will give the key. Let's paste here our secret key. Now you can keep this in the properties file and then get the value here in this method. After token generate method, we need another method which will extract the username from the token, and to extract the username from token we need a method to extract the claims from our token. So for that we can create a method extract claim, and here we will accept the token, and then we will accept the claim resolver, and here we will call another method to extract all the claims from the particular token, and from that claims we will extract a particular claim. So let's go and create this extract all claim methods. So this will be a private method and it will return claims. This will accept string token return. So we will use same JWTs dot parser builder dot set sign in key. So here we will call our same method get sign in key to get the key, and then we will call the build dot parse claims JWS dot get body. In the pass claims JWS is required token, so let's pass it. Now this method will return all the claims from our token, and we are using this here to get a particular claim. So let's now create a method to get the username. This method will be public string extract username let's change this to small e. Here of course we need a token, then we will return extract claim, we will give the token, and here we will give claim resolver as claims and then get subject. So this will return the email stored in the particular token. And after this we will add JWT authentication filter and user service in our project. JWT authentication filter is the class where we will validate the JWT for every API. So let's get started. In the configuration package, right click and in the new section click on Java class and write the name JWT authentication filter. Let's annotate this JWT authentication filter as component. You can annotate this as @service or @repository. Let's add annotation for required orgs constructor. Now we need to extend our filter with once per request filter. This will ask us to implement methods and we need to implement this do filter internal method. Let's click on OK. Before going into this method, let's create some objects. So we'll write private final JWT service and let's duplicate this and write user service here. We will create this class just a bit later. In this do filter internal, we have a request, response and a filter chain. Request is just API request and the response that we will return. Filter chain contains the other filters that need to be applied on the request. Let's start implementation in this do filter internal. First, we need to get the authorization header from the request. To do that, we can call request.getHeader and then we can give authorization in the parameter and we will get the auth header. After the auth header, let's create another final string JWT. We will store our JWT token in this string and after this let's duplicate this and rename it to user email. So we can save user email here. First of all, we need to check our auth header if it is empty or not. We will use a string utils dot is empty method and we will pass auth header. Let's add another condition and check if the auth is not starting from bearer. So let's add not here. We will use string utils dot start with, but we need to add one dependency to use this method. Let's go to our POM file and paste the dependency. The group ID for this dependency is org.apache.commons and the artifact ID is commons lang3. Let's refresh our POM file. Now let's use this apache.commons.lang3 string utils dot starts with. Here first param should be auth header and after comma you can write here bearer and then space. In the body of this if condition, let's call do filter of the filter chain. Let's give request and a response and don't forget to write return here. So this is done. Let's now get our token and store it in JWT variable. So this should be equal to auth header dot substring and here we will give 7 because if you count from B to this space there are 7 letters here. After getting the JWT, let's get user email. Before this, let's get the methods from JWT implementation and add them in JWT service. For now, we only need this extract username and generate JWT token. We will update this file when needed. Let's go back to our filter and call this method JWT service dot extract username, and here we need to give our JWT token in the parameter. Let's add another if condition here. And in this if condition, first we will check if the user email is not empty. So we will use string utils dot is not empty method, and we will give user email here. After this check, we will add another check for security context holder. So let's write here security dot get context dot get authentication is equals to null. In the body of this if condition, let's create an object of user details, and this we should get from user service dot user details service, and then load user by username. In our application, the username is equals to user email. Now let's create this user service. For this we need to go to the services folder and click here new Java class and click interface, write the name user service and click on enter. Let's create the implementation as well. Let's annotate this service with @service annotation and @required aux constructor. Let's create object of our user repository. In this service implementation, let's create a method user details service, and in this method let's return user details service by getting the username from our repository. Let's create this find by email in our user repository. So this will return one optional user. Let's update this from by ID to by email. Now let's go back to our user service implementation, and we need to add one semicolon here. Let's mention this method in user service, and let's update this to implements user service. Now let's go back to our JWT authentication filter and import this class. So the error is gone now. Now we need to create another method in our JWT service implementation, and that method we will use to check our token validity. So this will be public and this will return a boolean. The name should be is token valid, and this will accept a string token and user details. First we will extract the username from the token. For that we need to create a variable username, and here we can call our extract username method, and we need to pass here token. So this will give us the username from the token, and we will return here username dot equals user details dot get username, and here we need to call another method to check the expiration is token expired, and of course we will give token in the pattern. Now let's create this is token expired method. So we will return private boolean, let's accept the token. Let's return here and call extract claims, and here we will give token and we will give claims get expiration. After this we will check that if this is before our current date. So this will first get the expiration from our token and then check if the expiration is before the current date. This is it for JWT service implementation. Let's copy this method and add it in JWT service. Now we will use this method in our JWT authentication filter. Let's write here if JWT service dot is token valid. Let's give our JWT and user details that we just got. In this body of the if condition, let's create an empty security context. Let's call here security context holder dot create empty context. Now we need to create an object for our username password authentication token. Let's name it token, and this should be equal to new username password authentication token. And in the params we need to give user details, and for credentials we can pass here null, and in the last we need to give the authorities. After this, now let's access the token and set the details by giving new web authentication details source dot build details, and let's pass our request. After this, in our security contexts, let's set authentication as this token, and let's update the security context holder dot set contexts with our security contexts. And at the end we need to just call the do filter, and we need to pass the request and our response. And after this we will add security configuration and related beans in our project. So let's get started. Let's go to config package, right click and click on new Java class and name this Java class as security configuration. After creating the class we need some annotations. So first annotation is configuration. The second one, we need to enable web security. The third one we need is @required args constructor. After these annotations we need to inject user service and JWT authentication filter. So let's do that. So we will write private final JWT authentication filter, again private final user service. After this we need to add one bean, that is security filter chain. So let's do that. So we will start with @bean annotation, and this will be a public method, and this will return security filter chain. Let's name this method as security filter chain, and the params should be HTTP security. In this method, first we need to disable the CSRF. So let's go and do that. For that we need to get the HTTP request.csrf, and here let's give abstract HTTP configurer. And then write disable. After this we need to mention the authorized request. So let's write here authorize HTTP request, and then here let's name it as a request. After this, let's access request matches, and here we need to give our authentication controller path, that will be API/v1/auth and then /. So now we need to allow the access for this path for all the APIs. For that we can use here permit all. Now our authentication related APIs are free, and our Spring Security will not check the token for those APIs. The next step is to add the validations for other APIs, for example for admin related APIs or for user related APIs. To do that, we can write here dot request matches, and then here we need to mention the path for admin APIs. So we can write API slash v1 slash admin, and we can use dot has authority, and then we need to mention the role. So we can use role dot admin dot name. So now for admin controller APIs, our Spring Boot will check the role, and if the role is equal to admin, then only it will allow the access. Now we need to mention the APIs related to user. So let's go and duplicate that and mention here user, and we need to change this to user as well. Then here we need to mention any request dot authenticated. After this, we need to disable the session management, and to do that we can write here dot session management, and let's name it as manager, and here we need to mention manager dot session policy. Session creation policy should be stateless. After this, we need to mention the authentication provider, so we can add the filter details in it. So to do that, we can write authentication provider. Here we need to give the authentication provider bean, which we will create shortly, and then we need to call the add filter before, and here we need to give the JWT authentication filter. And on the last, we need to give the username password authentication filter dot class. And at the end, we need to build our HTTP request. Now our security filter chain is completed. Let's go and create this bean for authentication provider. So for that, we need to annotate this as bean, and then this will be a public, and this will return authentication provider. The name should be authentication provider as well. And in the body of this method, let's create object for DAO authentication provider, and let's name it as auth provider. Let's use new DAO authentication provider. In this authentication provider, we need to set the user details service, and as you know, we already have the user details service method in the user service, so we can use user service dot user detail service. After this, we need to set our password encoder, and for that we can use password encoder method that we will create shortly. At the last, we need to return our authentication provider. This is it for authentication provider method. This is it for authentication provider. Let's go and create the bean for our password encoder. For that, again, we need to use the bean annotation, and this will be a public method, and this will return one password encoder. The name of the method should be password encoder, and in the body we will just return new bcrypt password encoder. After this, at the end, we need to provide the bean for authentication manager, and for that we can write the return type as authentication manager, and we will give our authentication configuration in the param, and we will return the config.get authentication manager. So this is it for security configuration. Now let's go and create the endpoints which we mentioned here, so you can have the clear idea about our endpoints. For that, you need to go to the controller and click on new Java class and write the name of the controller. In my case, I will write admin controller. After this, let's go and create another controller that should be a user controller. The last controller we need is authentication controller that will hold our APIs related to authentication. And in authentication controller, let's annotate this as REST controller and @request mapping. And in the request mapping, the path should be /API/v1/auth. We need another annotation that is required args constructor. Now let's copy these annotations and use them in admin controller as well. For admin controller, we will update this to admin. Let's go to user controller now. For user controller, we need to update this to user. And after this, we will create a register API. So let's get started. First of all, we need a DTO for our register request. So let's click here and click on new package. We'll name this package as DTO. In this package, let's go and create a Java class with the name of signup request. Let's annotate this as data so we can get the getters and setters. Let's import the class as well. So here in the signup request, first we need to accept the first name. So we'll write private, the type will be string, and we'll name it as first name. Let's duplicate this and update this to last name. Let's keep this capital, and after first name and last name we need email, and at the end we need password. So that's it for the signup API. Now let's create another service where we will write the business logic for authentication related APIs. For this, we can go to our service package and click on new Java class and name it as authentication service. It should be an interface. After this, we need to create an service implementation. So right click on impl package and choose Java class and name it as authentication service implementation. Let's annotate this as a service. After this, let's write implements authentication service. Let's import this. After this, let's write here another annotation for our args constructor. So we'll write required args constructor. In this authentication service implementation, we need our password encoder and user repository. So let's go and create the objects. So we'll write private final user repository, and after this let's create the object for our password encoder. So we'll write password encoder. Now let's create the method to accept the signup request and create a user and save it in the repository. So for that, we'll write public, and this method will return a user, and let's name it as a sign up. So in the params, we will write our newly created DTO sign up request. Let's import this user. In this method, let's create a new user. And now we need to set the details for this user. So first let's set the email. So we'll use signup request dot get email. Let's duplicate this. And we need to repeat this for first name and last name. After first name and last name, let's assign a role to this user. So in this API, we'll just create the user with the role user. We'll not allow the users to create an admin user for our application. At the last, we need to set the password for this user. So we'll use our password encoder dot encode method, so we can encrypt our raw password to a hashed password. So here in the encode method, we need to give our raw password. So we'll use signup request dot get password. At the end, let's save this user in the user repository. So we'll use user repository dot save, and then we'll give the user. At the end, let's return this. Now we need to mention this method in our authentication service interface. So our service method is ready. Now let's go to our authentication controller and create the endpoint. First of all, we need to inject our authentication service here. So let's do that by writing private final authentication service. Now let's create a post API. So we'll use post mapping, and the path should be slash sign up. The method should be public, and this will return one response entity of type user, and the name for this method we can write as sign up. Let's import this user here. And in the request body, we need to mention the sign up request. So let's write @request body and then sign up request. In this method, let's return a response entity dot OK, and here we can call our sign up method in the authentication service. Let's pass the sign up request here, and our sign up API is ready. Before running this application, let's create a method to create an admin account. So as you know, we have two user types in our application. First one is admin and the second one is user. So we will create an admin account by default on the startup of the application. To write that method, let's go to our main class of our application and let's implement here command line runner. After this, let's inject our user repository here. So we'll use autowired, and here we'll write private user repository, and at the end we need to write one method, public void run, and we'll mention here some args. So we'll write our logic to create the admin user in this run method, but before that, in the user repository we need to create another method to find the user by the role. So on startup of our application, we need to check if the admin account is not there in our database, then only we can create an admin account. Otherwise, we will skip this process. So we can copy this and we will return a user here. And that user we should find by role. Let's mention here our role, enum, and change this to role. Now let's go to our main class and let's write here user admin account is equals to user repository dot find by role, and we'll give here role dot admin. Let's import the user here. After this, we'll check this admin account, and if this is equal to null, then only we will create another user. Now let's write the logic to create a user. So that should be equal to new user. Now let's set the details for the user. So we'll use user dot set email, and the email should be admin@gmail.com. Of course, you can change these details as required. On the second, we need to write the first name, and we can keep this as admin, and let's duplicate this and change it to second name. I will keep this as same as admin. Now let's set the user role, and the role should be role.admin. At the end, we need to set the password. So we can use a new bcrypt password, and then we need to call the encode method, and here we need to give the raw password. So I am giving the admin password as admin. At the end, we need to just save the user. So we'll call user repository dot save, and we'll give this user. Now this is done as well. Let's go and try to run our application. Okay, as you can see, we got an error, and this says that the JWT service required a bean. So let's go to our JWT service implementation, and we missed here one implements statement. So we can write here implements JWT service. After adding the implements statement, as you can see, this method is giving an error, and we just need to update this to public. This error is resolved. Now let's go and try again to run our application. As you can see, our application is up on port 8080 without any errors. Now let's go to our MySQL workbench and verify if our admin user got created or not. I am in my workbench and we have this user table. Let's click on this icon to view the records. And as you can see, we got one record for the admin. Now let's go to the Postman and call our signup API. In the signup request body, I am giving first name and last name as user. The email is user@gmail.com and the password is user. So let's click on this send button. And as you can see, we got 200. Okay, and we have the details of our newly created user as well. So now let's go to workbench and verify this. So we'll click on this icon again, and as you can see, the user record is here. And after this, we will work on the login API and we will generate the refresh token and JWT token in the response after the validation of user email and password. So let's get started. Before creating the API, let's create the DTO first. So we'll right click here and we'll click on Java class and we'll name this DTO as sign in request. In this request, we need one email and one password. So we'll write as private string email and we will duplicate this and change this to password. After this, let's annotate this with the data annotation. So we'll get the getters and setters for both of these properties. After this DTO, let's create another DTO for the response of sign in API. So we'll name it as JWT Authentication response. In this DTO, we need two properties. So first one is token. And let's duplicate this and rename it as a refresh token. Let's annotate this with data annotation as well, so we can get the getters and setters. Now let's go to our authentication service implementation and start writing the method. So we'll write here public, and the return type for this method should be JWT authentication response, and let's name it as sign in, and in the params we should accept the sign in request. In this method, we need to verify or validate the user's email and password, and we can do that by authentication manager. So let's go and create the object for that. So we'll write private final authentication manager, and let's use now this authentication manager here. So we'll write authentication manager dot authenticate, and here we can give a new username password authentication token, and in this token we can provide the Gmail. So we can write here dot get email and password. This authentication manager will validate our email and password, and it will return the exception if the email or password is wrong. And after this, we can fetch our user from our DB, and we can use JWT service to generate the token. So let's do that. So we'll write var user is equals to user repository dot find by email, and here we can give sign in request dot get email, and after this we need to use or else throw, and in this or else throw we can return illegal argument exception with the message email or password is invalid. After this we can call our JWT service now, but we need to create the object for that. So we'll write here private final JWT service, now let's create a variable here JWT and use that JWT service dot generate token, and we'll give here this user. After the JWT, we need to get the refresh token as well. So we'll duplicate this method and we'll rename this variable as a refresh token. And here instead of generate token, we'll call a method generate refresh token, and we'll give the user in the params and a new hash map. Now let's go and create this method in JWT service. To create the refresh token, we can just duplicate this method, and we need to rename this to generate refresh token, and in the params we need to accept the claims. So if we want to set some extra claims here, we can get these in this param. Now after this, let's call the set claims method and pass these extra claims in the params. After this, one last change we need to do in this generate refresh token. We need to extend the time, so we'll replace this one value, and this value is basically equal to 7 days. So our normal JWT token is valid for 1 day, and our refresh JWT token is valid for 7 days. Now let's copy this and mention in JWT service. Now as our JWT and refresh token is ready, and let's create the JWT response object and set the details and return. So we'll write here JWT authentication response dot set token. We'll pass it JWT, and let's duplicate this and do the same for refresh token. At the end, we need to return this JWT authentication response. Now let's copy this and mention this in authentication service. After this, let's go to our authentication controller and create the endpoint. So we'll use the same post mapping, and path for this API should be /sign in. Let's start writing the method. So we'll use public, and we'll return response entity of type JWT authentication response. Let's name this method as sign in, and in the request body we need to accept the sign in request. Here let's return response entity dot OK, and we'll call authentication service dot sign in. Let's pass the sign in request as well, and we are done with this sign in API. Let's run our application. As you can see, our application is up on 8080 without any errors. Let's go to the Postman and call our API. So as you can see, I am in the Postman, and let's update this email to admin@gmail.com, and let's set the password as admin and hit the send button. As you can see, we successfully got our token and refresh token, and this means that our APIs are working fine. And after this, we will create another API which is a refresh token, in which we will verify the refresh token from the request and return a new JWT token to the user. So let's get started. First of all, we need to create a DTO where we will get the token. So in the DTO package, right click and click on new Java class, and we'll name this class as refresh token request. In this class, we can just mention one property that should be private string token. Let's annotate this class as data so we can get getters and setters. Now let's go to our authentication service implementation and start writing a new method here. So the method will be public, and this will return the same JWT authentication response, and we can name this method as a refresh token, and in the params we can mention a refresh token request. In this method, first of all, we need to get the user email. So let's create a string variable here called user email, and we can call here our JWT service method extract username, and we'll give our token in the param, and we can get this token from our request. So now as we have the user email, now let's get the user from this user email. So we'll write user repository dot find by email, and here let's pass the email. After this, let's use or else throw for any error, and now check if this refresh token is valid or not. So we'll call the JWT service dot is token valid method, and here we will pass the refresh token and then our user. Now let's go to this is token valid method, and as you know, we already created this method, and here we are again extracting the username from the token. We are checking if the username from token is equal to the username from our DB, and then we are again calling another method is token expired, and in this method we are basically verifying the date. Now in this if condition, we are sure that the user token is valid and user is saved in our database, and now we can create a new JWT token and return to the user. So we'll write var JWT, and then we'll call JWT service dot generate token method, and we'll pass user here. So this will generate a new JWT token with updated expiration date. Now let's copy this part and send the response. Here I just created the object for JWT authentication response, and I am setting the newly created JWT token. And for the refresh token, we can get this from our request, and then we'll return this JWT response. Otherwise, we can return here null. Now that's it for this method. Let's copy this and mention in authentication service. Now let's go to our authentication controller and create the endpoint. So we can copy this API, and we need to change the endpoint. So we can type here refresh, and we can update the name of the method, and the request body should be refresh token request. Let's update this and import the class and pass this to this method and update this to refresh token. Now this is it for this API. Before running our application, let's create the endpoints for admin controller and user controller. So here we'll use the get mapping, and this method will be public, and this will return response entity of type string. Let's name this as say hello, and in this method we'll return response entity dot okay, and in the body we can just send hi admin. So now let's copy this and create the endpoint here in the user controller, and instead of admin we can type here user. Now let's run our application. So as you can see, our application is up on 8080 without any errors. Now let's go to our Postman and call our APIs. As you can see here, I am on the sign in API. Let's send this request, and we should get the JWT and refresh token in the response. So from here, let's copy this refresh token, and in the refresh token API, let's replace this with our token and send the request. So this should work fine, and this should return a new token with the refresh token. Now let's try to test our role validation, and here as you can see, we have an API for admin endpoint, and from the refresh token API, let's copy this token and try to hit the admin endpoint. So in this authorization tab, we should select the bearer token, and let's paste here our token. And as you can see, we are getting hi admin and 20 okay. That means that this is working fine. Now let's try to hit the user API with this admin token. So in the authorization, we will paste the token, and this should return us an unauthenticated, because here I am logged in as admin, but I am trying to access the endpoint of user. As you can see, we got 403. This means that this is working fine properly. Now let's try to log in our user and hit the same endpoints. So we'll write user@gmail.com, and in the password we'll type user, because we already created a user with this Gmail in our previous video. So we'll send the request, and we got our token. Now let's copy this token, and let's go to the admin endpoint and paste here the token and send the request. As expected, we got 403. Now let's try to access our user endpoint, and this should give 200. And you can see it gave 200, and the message is hi user. All of our APIs are working fine.
Thanks for tuning in today, and as always, keep coding, and most importantly, stay secure out there in the digital world. Until next time, happy coding.